Good morning. It's good to see you today. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to talk about a principle that is in Romans chapters 1 and 2. If you'll turn over there with me, Romans chapters 1 and 2. We will refresh our minds about the principle that is there, and then we'll talk about it at this session and then also at our 11 o'clock session as well. The concept, of course, is no excuses. We live in a world where excuses are tolerated and even sometimes encouraged, where we sometimes feel as if it's okay for us to say, yeah, but. I know I should have, but there were circumstances, and so now I'm off the hook. That kind of thinking can become a habit for us, and that kind of thinking is detrimental to our circumstance and to everybody else's. And so we want to talk about it just a little bit. Now, first of all, in Romans chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, Romans 2, verse 1, the Apostle Paul says, "Therefore you have no excuse, every one of you who passes judgment. For in that which you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same things." Now, we're coming in right in the middle of a kind of a 3-chapter statement on sin. Everybody has the sin problem. And in chapter 2, the Apostle Paul has turned his attention to the Jews, and he has said, Jews, you have no excuse either. That's kind of what he's saying. And the premise that he works from is, you are judging the Gentiles, calling them guilty, but in fact, you are guilty just like they are. So that's the first verse I want you to think about regarding no excuses. The Apostle Paul, by the Holy Spirit, says to the Jews, you have no excuse either, because you're doing the same thing they're doing. The things you're condemning them about as you judge them, you're doing those same things as well. Then go back with me to chapter 1. Now go back to chapter 1. In chapter 1, beginning in verse 18, he's talking to the Gentiles. Romans 1 verse 18, he begins to talk to the Gentiles, and he says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them." Now verse 20. "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse." You have a situation where the Gentiles in chapter 1 are without excuse. They are without excuse because they could see God. They could see God in what? What does he say there in verse 20? In the creation, they can clearly see God. And so the Gentile couldn't say, well, I didn't know about that. I was alive and I was on planet Earth, but I wasn't aware that there was a God. I did not see that there was God. There was no evidence that there was a God. The Gentile cannot say that. The Gentile has no standing with which to say, I didn't know, because they did know, because the creation makes it evident or makes it clear or makes it plain. And so the Gentile was responsible to God because the Gentile could see God in creation. Today, sometimes you'll hear that described as intelligent design. You can see around you that there was intelligence in the design. That is so. It is also so that is a tremendous oversimplification of what creation does for us in showing us God. The vastness of it all shows us the vastness of God. There's so many aspects to creation that tell us about God. And the Gentile couldn't say, well, I didn't know. The Jew couldn't say, well, I didn't know, because the Jew had the benefit of the same thing that the Gentile had. The Jew could see creation. But as Paul goes on back in chapter 2, the Jew also had the benefit of having the oracles of God, the truth of God. God worked through those people, and so the Jews should have known as well. And so the result of all of this in Romans 1 and 2 is there are no excuses, and everybody has the sin problem in chapter 3. Now you know that, right? You know that in chapter 3 and verse 23, the Apostle Paul makes a statement, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There are none righteous, not one. Everybody has the sin problem, and to our point this morning, nobody has a legitimate excuse. I want that to kind of settle in on us this morning. I want us to get really comfortable with the idea that we don't have any excuses. And we cannot say, yeah, but. And we can't say, but that person did such and caused me to sin. We don't have that right, and that is not our reality. And so, no excuses. I'm going to say that a lot this morning. There are no excuses. We each have to deal with our circumstance, and we each have to do the things that we are supposed to do. Right now in our world, it appears to me that Satan has given us this monstrous opportunity to use the virus and all of the things associated with it as a great big excuse to not do the things that we ought to do. And so we are tempted by the virus. We are tempted to say, well, I would do what I'm supposed to do, but the COVID thing, I can't live up to my obligations, as if somehow a virus running around changes my obligations before God and to mankind. It doesn't change things a bit. I'm not saying we don't modify the way we behave. That's evident this morning. We have modified the way we behave, no question about that. But the virus or any other issue does not change my responsibilities to my God. It does not change the obligations I have. No excuses. God is not a God of excuses. He makes the point here at the beginning of Romans, as he is establishing the all have sinned point, that there are no excuses. And so it is improper for me to say I would worship God, but I would be faithful except for, I would contribute as I should except. That we cannot get into that habit, because then that becomes the thing that drives us, and we find ourselves down the road, maybe even years later, not doing what we're supposed to do and always having a reason for it. Back up with me. Go with me all the way to the beginning. And let's look at excuses there in the beginning. Before we move on here, let's go back to the beginning. Go back with me to Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3. You have read this section before. You are familiar with this section. Adam and Eve choose to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God said, don't eat of the tree. Serpent said it'll be okay. In fact, not only will it be okay, you'll be like God. And so they disobeyed and they ate of the tree. I want you to notice what happens beginning down in verse 11. God asked a couple of questions. In verse 11, Genesis 3, a couple of questions. First question is, who told you that you were naked? And then he follows it up immediately with, as if he's not waiting for an answer. And then he says, have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? Now, God already knows, but he asks the question. Have you eaten from the tree that I told you not to eat from? Verse 12, look at it in your Bible. Verse 12. The man said, the woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me from the tree, and I ate. Now that is true. That is true, but that is also an excuse. What would be an appropriate answer to the question to Adam, have you eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? What's the right answer? Yes. That's the answer. That is not what he said. He said, the woman that you gave me, she gave to me from the tree, and I ate. And immediately the Lord turns his attention to the woman. You'll notice that in verse 13. Immediately he turns to the woman, and you can just imagine Adam thinking, oh, that was close. But I successfully shifted blame from self to her. The woman for whom he was so grateful initially now becomes his excuse. And it's almost, I would imagine, like this tremendous weight has been lifted. I was in a tight spot, but now I've shifted blame over there, so she's going to be the one to have to deal with it, because after all, she's the one really that did it anyway. And the Lord asked her, did you do this? What is this that you have done? Well, the woman says, verse 13, the serpent deceived me, and I ate. That is also true. But she didn't say, I did wrong. She said, we're going to shift the blame from me to the serpent. The serpent is guilty, not me. There were circumstances, you see, that caused me to do what I shouldn't have done, and so let's talk about that. And so what does the Lord do? The Lord immediately, verse 14, turns his attention to the serpent, and you can just imagine Eve going, ooh, that was close. But I successfully shifted the blame and the focus to the serpent, and everything's going to be fine. And beginning in verse 14, the Lord deals with the serpent. Verse 14 and verse 15, he's talking to the serpent, and I just wonder if Adam and Eve were anything like me, it would be so. I just wonder if Adam and Eve were standing there thinking, we barely dodged that one, but thank goodness the serpent is the one that's going to get it. And then verse 16, the Lord turns his attention back to the woman. We're not off the hook. The woman now becomes the object of the Lord's wrath. But Adam is still in the clear, it seems. The Lord deals with the woman. Adam may be getting a little nervous. Verse 17, then he turns his attention to Adam. And he says, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat from it. There are no excuses. Everybody in the story is dealt with. Just like in life now. I can say, well, I know I should be faithful to God, but it's hard right now. And I can kind of assuage my feelings of guilt, and I can push the blame off somewhere else to make myself feel better, but I haven't changed the reality of God and me. When Adam shifted blame to Eve, and when Eve shifted blame to the serpent, it didn't change the reality of God and Adam and God and Eve. Nothing changed that circumstance. We can talk about it like it did, we can act like it did, and they probably acted like that, but it didn't change it. And it is so today. When I fail to be kind to the people I know I'm supposed to be kind to, I cannot say, yeah, but so-and-so made me mad, or they said this, or you don't understand, this was happening. I can come up with all kinds of excuses, but it doesn't change the reality that is, I didn't do what I was supposed to do. There are people in life that set good examples for us and bad examples for us. There are people in life who are always late. No matter what's going on, they're always late, and people who are always early. That's just how that goes. There are people who always do their assignment and people who rarely do their assignment. Have you noticed that? There are people who are always prepared for whatever it is they're supposed to do and people who are rarely prepared. That's how that goes. And the people who are always ready, and there are people like that, I've met a few of them, people who are always ready for whatever they need to do, whatever their responsibility is, they don't walk around with a pocket full of excuses. They just do what they're supposed to do. Those of us who struggle with excuses are the ones we're not always ready. We're not always prepared. We're not always on time. We don't always have what we're supposed to have. And we always have this list of excuses, this reasons why, but still we know down deep we just didn't do what we were supposed to do. And that's why we're here. That's why we're in this situation. Adam and Eve provide a really good example for us that says the reason why we didn't do right has no bearing on the fact that we didn't do right. If I refuse to worship God and serve Him as I should, the reason why really doesn't matter. That's just how it is. If I reject His will in my life, why I did it isn't the point. The point is I rejected His will in my life. I may have some reasons I think are really good. It was too hard. The people around me made it difficult. Somebody said something that hurt my feelings, and so on, but it doesn't matter. So with all of that, I want you to think a little bit now back over in Romans chapter 1 and Romans chapter 2 about where the Apostle Paul's going with this. Why does he bring up in chapter 1, they have no excuse? They are without excuse. Well, he is trying to establish that the Gentiles knew enough about God to seek Him out. They knew enough about God to ask the basic questions. Who is my Creator, and what do I owe my Creator? How can I find out more about my Creator? How can I submit to my Creator? Because obviously I have a Creator. But they did not do that. They, in fact, took the opposite approach to that. Go back with me to Romans chapter 1. Verse 21, he says, for even though they knew God. Now, he has already said in verse 20, they're without excuse because they knew God. Now he says very clearly, they knew God. Even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks. But they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Verse 22, professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds, and of four-footed animals, and crawling creatures. Sometimes we lose that progression when we look at this. It's not just that the Gentiles said, I don't see God. I don't know what to do. They didn't just do that. They said that and then said, but we're pretty smart, and so what we're going to do is we're going to take some wood and some various things and carve out some idols that look like creation, and we're going to worship those things instead. That's how smart we are. Now think about that for a moment. We are so wise that what we're going to do is worship something that we carved out of something that was created like us, that looks like something that can't reason like I can reason. We're going to worship the image of a bird or an animal that cannot reason and cannot think like we do. We're going to worship that instead of the God who obviously made that. And when all of that's going on, we're going to look at self and we're going to say, we're pretty wise, aren't we? We've got it all figured out. Look at us. And so one of the things that tells us is, when we use excuses like, I don't know, I couldn't figure it out, I wasn't sure, so I didn't do, I wasn't confident, and so I stopped short. When we use that kind of excuse about living up to our service to God, we become the absolute opposite of that which we want to be. We want to be wise people. We do, all of us. We want to be at least reasonable people. But when we use excuses, we start down a path that terminates in we're literal fools. We literally become fools. Because the process of using excuses in our spiritual lives especially takes us further and further and further away from God. It does not lead to Him, it leads away from Him. And we end up saying, look how smart I am, as I'm literally being foolish. That's the first thing we learn out of chapter 1 about excuses. The other thing out of chapter 2 and the Jews that I want you to get regarding excuses is that excuses make us hypocrites. Plain and simple. When I use excuses, I become a hypocrite. That's how that is. And not just regarding spiritual things. It's a principle that applies across the board. But specifically regarding spiritual things. If I'm going to be a man of excuses, I'm going to be a hypocrite. Because see, I don't preach and teach, and you don't preach and teach, it's okay to not do your job, just have a really good reason. It's okay to not live up to responsibility, just have a really good reason. We don't preach and teach that to people. We don't say that to people. But if we're living that, then we're hypocritical. Back to Romans 2, verse 1. Therefore, you have no excuse, every one of you who passes judgment, that is, passes judgment on other people, who passes judgment. For in that which you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same things. And we know that the judgment of God rightly falls upon those who practice such things. Verse 3, look at it. But do you suppose this, O man, when you pass judgment on those who practice such things and do the same yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God? Well, the answer to the question literally in many of our lives is yes, I do believe that. I absolutely believe that. I believe I can practice the wrong things and still go to heaven, but when you do the wrong things, you're not going to make it. I can believe that. I can talk myself into that. No, it's not so, but I can talk myself into it. And that's his question in verse 3. Do you really believe that you can refuse to do God's will and still end up in heaven when you condemn other people for not doing God's will? Yes. Sometimes my behavior indicates that I would believe that. And he's pointing out the literal hypocrisy of the position. All because of excuses. Because I would never, and nor would you say, I can do wrong and still get to heaven, but when you do wrong, you can't get to heaven. We won't say it like that. What we'll say is excuses. There were extenuating circumstances in my life that caused me to not do what I was supposed to do. You don't have those extenuating circumstances from my perspective, so you are doomed to hell. I'm going to be okay. But the Apostle Paul says that's not so. No excuses. And so where we end up is we have to submit to God and be honest with ourselves about who we are and what we're doing. And we have to reject the tremendous pull to make excuses for ourselves, to shift the blame to someone else. Adam did it. It worked for just a moment. Eve did it. It worked for a shorter moment, but it really didn't work at all. And the Jews did it in chapter 2, and God called them out on it through the Apostle Paul by saying, do you really think this is going to work? And the Gentiles did it in chapter 1, and God called them out through the Apostle Paul by saying, you're professing to be wise, but you're actually being fools. We don't want to be that. And so as we wrap up this year, and many of us are anxious to wrap up this year, and as we hope and pray the next one is different, how about we start it out with an attitude of no excuses. I'm just going to do what I'm supposed to do. I'm going to serve God the way I'm supposed to serve. I'm going to serve people the way I'm supposed to serve. I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do. How about we start out that way? In our next session, we have 6 areas wherein we have no excuse. We will begin that, Lord willing, at 11 o'clock. Thank you so much for listening and for participating. And if there is anything we can do for you to help you in your spiritual life, you need to let us know. We are here not because we're all perfect. We're here because we all need help. We all need encouragement. We all need forgiveness in the name of Jesus. And if you are in a situation where you need the prayers of the congregation, or maybe you need to make changes in your life and you want the encouragement that we can provide, that's exactly why we're here. In this moment, as Brother Bailey leads us in the song, no excuses. Let's be real and honest with ourselves about where we are and what we need, and let's do the things that need to be done. Let's stand and sing.